So I have with me today a special guest, Dr. Keith Buhler, and he has written a chapter in a new anthology that's coming out soon called Into the Light by David Hicks. It is actually a compiled anthology by David Hicks. And there are several authors that I'm sure most of my listeners have heard that are going to be featured in this book, like Andrew Kern, I think Joshua Gibbs, lots of different wonderful authors, and Dr. Buhler is one of them. So I reached out to him and asked him if he would join us and talk about his chapter in the book. So, Dr. Bueller, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this. I read this essay that you wrote, and I think it's wonderful, beautiful, and has a lot of important things to say in the classical education world. So, before we dive into your essay, what I'd like you to first do is introduce yourself to my listeners and just give us an overview of how you have found yourself in the classical education world.
Yeah, sure. So these days I teach at a classical Orthodox parish school, as well as I teach at a local college here, an honors college. And that whole journey started for me in college primarily. I went to the Torrey Honors College. Back then it was Torrey Honors Institute at Biola University. And my dad was a Biola grad. Some of my siblings have gone to Biola, but it was the Torrey program that, really, you could say, lit that fire for me. I was homeschooled in for most of my life. My parents homeschooled us in the 80s and 90s. So I loved reading. I was self-motivated. I loved learning. I didn't have those negative associations with school. And but in high school, I sort of got stuck on all the structure and the, requirements, and everything had to be just so. And so I found out about great books education. And I was like, even as a 16, 17-year-old, I was like, whatever that is, I want that. Discussions, papers, not a lot of busy work. So after college, I don't know that I was the best student even in college, and I just loved it. But after college, I decided to try to get a job teaching. And for me, teaching is the place where we really learn how to be a student and reread the books and really learn how to study and go deep into the great tradition. So that's kind of what I've been doing the last 17, 18 years.
That's awesome. Do you have children?
Yeah, I've got four kids of my own.
Okay, I do too. Are you homeschooling them? That's the next question.
So 5 years ago, my wife and I moved from our classical Christian school where we were teaching to actually launch a parish school at St Andrew in Riverside. So our four kids are enrolled there from kindergarten up to seventh grade, and my wife and I both teach there.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I wondered, and I homeschooled my children too, so I know how your parents felt.
Hmm.
Oh, it's a wonderful experience. So it says in your essay that you've been teaching for many years. Have you always taught sort of in the classical Christian world, or have you been kind of in different realms?
Yeah, I've been very blessed to. My first job was in the classical Christian world, the essentially the Torrey Honors high school kind of program. I taught there for 5 years. I left just to go to graduate school. I was able to teach in a public university in the philosophy department while I was working on my doctoral work there.
Mhm.
I taught at Asbury University for a few years and was able to teach. I was able to kind of make it into a great books class without calling it that. Taught like C.S. Lewis, philosophy of C.S. Lewis, as well as basic philosophy classes. And then when we came back from grad school, there's always this sort of like college or high school dilemma for people who maybe want to get an MA or get a PhD. And the college market, aside from adjuncting, which I really enjoy doing, the college market is brutal. There's too many PhDs and not enough jobs. But the high school market is hungry for these classical schools that actually value that level of
Mhm.
education and say, get in front of our students, teach them how to write really well, grade them really hard, make them read whole books. So the appetite for classical high schools was very clear, and that was, God's writing on the wall from my perspective.
That's great. So in this essay, before we dive into this, I really, if you can, I want my listeners to hear a little bit about this new anthology by David Hicks. What do you know about it? Like, I don't even know when it's coming out. Do you have any idea?
Yes, it did release. It released just a few weeks ago, so it's
Oh,
out.
okay.
Should be ready.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Okay, good.
Um, but so David Hicks and Father Anthony Gilbert are the editors, and Father Anthony Gilbert is a longtime classical educator. And he's the one who reached out to me. So I don't know, who did what on the editing side, but he wanted to compile some Orthodox voices that are already in classical education and just put everybody together into one volume because we have a lot of Orthodox educators at classical, either Protestant or Catholic schools, or even some of our public charters are classical.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and we do have a few Orthodox schools. I've gotten connected with folks through starting the St Andrew Academy, but there's not really a whole lot of writing in that kind of space. If Chris Perrin, who's very, very well regarded and a great writer, he actually became Orthodox just a few years back, but he's not necessarily made that his brand, if you know what I mean. So we just thought let's get everybody who's doing this in the classroom at the college level, administration, kind of into one volume.
Yeah, I'm excited to read it. Actually, David Hicks just emailed me a copy of it yesterday. He said
Oh,
it's in
good.
the
Okay,
mail. So I
great.
didn't realize it was actually out now, but yes, I'm excited to read it. So I'm happy to know that it's out now because I want my listeners to get a copy of it, especially anybody who's Orthodox.
Hmm.
Um, but this essay that you particularly wrote, I'm going to tell our listeners the name of this chapter is "The Teacher as Mentor: Initiating Students into a Life of Wisdom Seeking." So, as I read this chapter, I was very struck with how important this message is that you're delivering. And so, I'd like you to explain what prompted you to make this the topic you would contribute to the book.
Well, Father Anthony Gilbert, many years ago, was the dean of the St. Catherine University in San Marcos, California, before it unfortunately closed down. And he had invited me to give a talk to his college students. And the topic that was really on my heart at the time was school as real life, right? There's this contrast between
Mm.
being in school and then getting into the real world. And when I think about that contrast, I understand what people mean, and I felt the same way when I was in college that my life will begin at graduation and these kinds of things. But when I think about what that means, it really means my economic life, right? I'm going to go work and I'm going to go, maybe support myself and get into the workforce. But that's not real life. When I think about real life, I think about our relationships, how we pray, how we love people, how we forgive, how we actually humble ourselves and learn from the lessons that God sends us and the crosses that we bear in life. So, your attitude towards humbly learning from your life circumstances is part of real life. And that's actually one of the essentials of real life. And that's what you can learn in school. That's what you can learn in college, in K through 6. My second grader right now is working on forgiveness, promptly asking for forgiveness and giving and actually forgiving people. That skill, if she can get it down, that's going to serve her whole life long. So this is real life. That was kind of the theme of that talk. Um, and he loved it. And so when he started doing the anthology, he asked me to convert it to a chapter. So the direction I sort of went with it was, what are we doing in the classroom? The teacher is delivering content. I'm not going to deny that. But when you think about a whole school, the teachers are representing a form of life, a way of life, a way of
Mhm.
pursuing wisdom in their own life, pursuing virtue, a life of repentance. And as a community, the teachers and the admin and the staff, if there's clergy, right, if it's a church school, the pastors, everybody is kind of representing to these students, this is what real life looks like, and we're living it right now with you in the classroom. Even though we're here teaching you maybe math and maybe history, these specific subject areas, the background is that we're living our life together and we're inviting the young people into this form of life. And so when you think of it that way, I just think that um, the idea that you could just send your kid to a school where the teachers are living a way of life that you don't want them to imitate, and the teacher will just be able to pass off the content, that begins to be a bit more suspicious. And I think that, I'm encouraging people to take that more seriously and say, who do I want my children around, and who do I want them to imitate and to receive a form of life from?
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious with your work with the school. Is it St. Andrew's that you're working with? Yeah.
Yeah, St Andrew Academy at the St Andrew Parish. Yeah.
How are you how are you putting this to practice in your school? Can you give any practical examples, and like how do you help teachers do this? How do you help administrators get behind it, and parents as well?
hmm with parents, it's always the hardest one, right?
Hmm.
Parents, especially if they're not homeschooling, if they're enrolling their kids, even if it's a church school or a part-time, like a homeschool co-op, parents are busy and overwhelmed and are looking for help. They're not looking for additional responsibility. They're looking for help delegating some of that responsibility. So it's always the hardest to invite parents to think of their modeling as learners being the most important thing for the students as learners. So it's not like I, as the teacher, am going to convince your kid to love learning if you, as the parent, are always communicating, I'm so glad I'm out of school. I'm so glad I didn't have to learn Latin. Wow, that looks like a really hard book. What is the teacher thinking assigning that hard book, right? That sort of misalignment, you're going to win. The parent's going to win. The teachers can't necessarily overcome that. As you get maybe in the older grades, a student can take it upon themselves to say, wow, I really want this person as a mentor, even though they're not my parent. So yeah, so parents are always the hardest. It comes down to your sort of hiring practices. Like if you're recruiting for subject experts, there's maybe a bigger pool. But if you're recruiting for trusted members of the community who also happen to be able to teach or also happen to have a subject area of expertise, that pool is much smaller. And then once you bring them in, you do things to foster a community of friends. The late James Selby, who wrote a lot of the Memoria Press rhetoric curriculum, said, I've tried every kind of teacher training that you can imagine, and the only thing that's worked is a faculty book club. Just being together and learning for ourselves. We're not putting on a show for the students, right? We really want to learn. Being together, that creates relationships, it creates trust, it creates mutual supports. And when you have a faculty of friends, the students can tell, and it does have a trickle down effect. So that may not sound very practical, but I think that's one of the things that we've tried to cultivate at the academy. And one thing I recommend to anybody, even if it's departmental or if it can't be the whole school, the faculty are continuing their education and they're excited. They're bringing fresh energy to the classroom.
I love that you're saying this. So, yeah, as a classical education leader, I recommend to schools all the time that you need to think of your teachers as learners, not just the students in your school, but the teachers need to actually embrace the idea that they need to learn and grow, because that is modeling humility, which is exactly what
Yes,
your paper is about. You're,
that's right.
so I love that. I love that. And I tell schools all the time, try to find a book that you can read together as a school. I'm curious, what book titles have your teachers done together?
So after we kind of got started, the first year was craziness.
Hmm.
We would do every other faculty meeting was kind of on the practicals, problem solving, upcoming events, and then every other one was on training. So once a month we would do either a lecture or we would work through a book like some of Chris Perrin's works on like 10 traits of a good teacher.
Hmm.
We did sort of a overview of classical, the trivium, the quadrivium. We talked about how to teach math in a classical way. Um, what else did we do? We read some C.S. Lewis poetry, things that are kind of like accessible and interesting. And then we do have a recommended reading list that's sort of like, if you're going to be here, for more than a year, some people kind of come and go. as teachers. But if you're going to be here and you're going to raise your kids here and you're going to be part of the community, these are the books that you want to read to go on your classical education journey, whether you had it in college or not, right? We're always beginning. So things like the Ravi Jain and Kevin Clark book on,
Yes.
the classical tradition. Um, I like a lot of G.K. Chesterton. I think for me, between graduation and starting to teach, the guys that I was like really reaching for to try to like get more of this classical stuff were like Peter Kraft, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, sort of more modern people, but who could kind of point me in the right direction into older books.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I just give people, I have a little list of recommended readings. Take it at your own pace, and that will open up other little doors.
That's lovely. I have some books recommended on my website as well, a resource of books, and I love to recommend The Awakening of Miss Prim. It's actually a fiction book,
Okay,
but it's very
I'll write that
interesting.
down.
And it starts off with one of the little girls actually studying the icon of the Trinity, and she's painting it. It's a very good book. It's not an Orthodox book, but it was fun
Hmm.
that that particular icon is kind of a central part in the book. It's written by an Italian author, so that's a fun
Amazing.
book if you wanted a novel. And then from an essay perspective, one of my favorites that I like to tell people about, just because I'm a huge George MacDonald fan, is The Fantastic Imagination by George MacDonald. It's a short essay, but it is rich with pedagogy. Like
Mm,
how do you teach literature? How do you teach a fairy tale? It's a very, very
hmm.
well written short essay. And it's in the Dish of Orts, which is just a bunch of his lectures, and you can
Okay.
find it on the Gutenberg Project, the Dish of Words, and it's the very last essay, The Fantastic Imagination. Anyhow, so that's my recommendation. But C.S. Lewis poetry, that's an interesting choice because he's not really known as a poet.
Right. He wanted to be. Um,
Right.
yeah, he's got a great poem, for example, on Oxford, and it's kind of a reflection on how Oxford is this place that resists the crass materialization of life. It's Oxford is this bulwark of culture and higher intellectual things, and of course, the highest thing is prayer. But even sort of higher cultural things, you have to, especially in America, you have to be a little bit countercultural to think that ideas matter and things like rhetoric and logic matter, and not just commercial, getting a job, making money, and having enough money to send your kids to private school.
Yeah. So I guess that's a poem I'm gonna have to read and put on my list for resources. That sounds like a good one. I am a recent right now. I'm actually reading a book called After Prayer by Malcolm Guite.
Okay, yeah,
Fantastic. That would
love
probably be
him.
another good one for teachers. It's he kind of does this. What he does is he has this poem called Prayer by George Herbert, and
Hmm.
what he does is he creates little sonnets based on each line of that poem. So they're their own individual poems based on the line from that poem. It is a beautiful, beautiful work of art. I mean, it is. Ah, there's one poem in there. I think it's poem number 12 called A Kind of Tune, and it's based on, I think, the eighth line in the Herbert poem. And it is a poem about the music of Christ and how he sings the song of salvation in his mother's womb. It is, and then at the end, you'll hear it coming. You hear it coming from the empty tomb. It's a beautiful poem. I can't, I should just
Wow.
read it. I have it right here. Maybe I will. Hold on. Only because
Well,
it's so worth talking about because teachers do need to read these things. Okay. A Kind of Tune by Malcolm Guite. A kind of tune, a music everywhere and nowhere. Love's long, lovely undersong, a trace in time, a grace note in the air, borne to us from the place where we belong, on every passing breeze and in the breath of every creature, all things hear and fear. For faintly through our fall, we too may hear the strong song of the sun that does undoes death. And one day we will hear it unimpaired, the joy of all the sorrowful, the song of all the saints who cry, How long? The hidden hope of all who have despaired. He sang it to his mother in the womb, and now it echoes from his empty tomb.
Oof.
Yeah, it's this book. I just Malcolm Guite. You can't go wrong with Malcolm, right?
No, no. Oh my
Ugh,
gosh. Well, I know
yeah.
that you mentioned in your first email that your George MacDonald is one of your favorites, and you saw that I had a George MacDonald quote at the top of my chapter because I was reading Little Gibby at the time, and he has that little quote about I actually say quotation because I correct my students on that. A quotation
Oh,
is a
that's
noun.
funny. My mother corrects me on that all the time.
Okay.
Don't say quote, say
I,
quotation.
I barely missed your mom's censure on this one. The quotation is about that um, you the log and the plank that you're whatever we pretend to teach our students or when we're raising our kids, we better be working 10 times as hard on that in ourselves, right? It's this problem of hypocrisy that as a teacher you have to stand up and say a bunch of really profound things that you're not living up to those. And um and so that's the kind of like I love that McDonald, his character emanates out of his writing, right? That's something C.S. Lewis said, was that it was his wisdom more than his writing style that attracts you
Hmm.
to him. And I think that's kind of I think that's exactly what as great teachers, you have to be a presence in the classroom rather than just a content delivery mechanism. They can get that from the AI, but they used to be able to even get it from online classes and books and these kinds of things. So, but
Hmm.
Malcolm Guite, beautiful.
Yeah, let's read this quote that you have from C.S. Lewis. I mean, from George MacDonald, same person, right?
Yeah,
Almost.
right.
Okay. George MacDonald says, and this is on your essay, to try too hard to make people good is one way to make them worse. The only way to make them good is to be good, remembering well the beam and the mote. The time for speaking comes rarely, the time for being never departs. That is powerful. And that was one of the things when I saw this, I was like, oh, it's a George MacDonald quote. And he's right. The time for speaking comes rarely, the time for being never departs. Like, this is one of the things I talk about to teachers all the time is do more listening and less talking.
Hmm.
Asking good and meaningful questions and giving the students the time and the space to actually contemplate and have a rich and meaningful conversation. But the role of the teacher usually is to step back and listen and then guide as they need guided. But these children, they can come up with some pretty profound things because they are made in the image of God and they actually have a very large capacity for understanding rich and meaningful things.
Hmm.
And I think that that is a really important message for classical teachers, especially to be okay with quiet, to be okay with long silence after you've asked a question that has, you know, meaningful, thoughtful ideas embedded in it. And so
Hmm.
I don't know when I read that the time for speaking comes rarely, the time for being never departs. I think that's completely true, and I wish that more people would embrace that. I think that's a really important part of the pedagogy in a classical school.
And I want to put in a plug here for church schools or parish schools or even parish, homeschools 1 day a week, 3 days a week, where parents can meet and collaborate. Because you hear a lot when we started a parish school, I heard a lot from a lot of different people about the horror stories, the obstacles, the drama, the pain that you're going to face. I've even heard this saying many times, start a school, split a church, that you're putting the
Mm.
integrity of the parish at risk and these kinds of things. And I can attest that it is challenging and that living in that close of community with that many points of overlap brings with it its own challenges, just like living in a small town, which I've never done. But I've heard that living in a small town, everybody knows everything that's going on with everybody. However, on the other side, I get to go to church with about 60% of my students. I get to ask for their forgiveness on Forgiveness Sunday, which is coming up
Yeah.
in up 2 or 3 weeks. I get to pray with them. We do a morning orthros, like an abbreviated orthros service every school day. So they don't see me just as the teacher, the classic shock that a student has when they see a teacher at the grocery store because they go, "Why aren't you in your classroom?" They don't see me just as a teacher. They see me as a member of their community, and I see them as my future priest potentially, or my future, daughter-in-law potentially. If she grows up and I have two boys, I see them as my future bishop. If any of these people go to the monastery, right, and come back, so it brings a totally different perspective that I'm not teaching fifth graders every year, new group of fifth graders, they
Mhm.
disappear, new group of fifth graders disappear. It's not an assembly line. It's a life that I'm living with my students as I age up through my career, as they age up through their careers, as my children age up. So it's a very different experience. And that's new for me at St. Andrew the last 5 years, but you really are, um, you're living life together and you see each other as whole people and not just sort of a transaction of education.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. That's beautiful. And for our listeners who don't know what Forgiveness Sunday is, this is an Orthodox tradition. You want to explain it?
Yeah, so it's really a powerful rite that we do at the beginning of Lent. So about, say 6 weeks before Easter, is that we kick off the Lenten season of repentance with a very long and very penitent, very humbling service. Um, and we're praying together. And at the end of that, then beginning with the priest, the clergy, um, he will bow down, touch his feet, and say, "Forgive me, a sinner," to the parishioner in front of him. And then you say, "God forgives," or there's a different formula. God forgives, and I forgive. And then you ask the priest for forgiveness. This is not confession forgiveness, right? This is, I'm just acknowledging that we've been living together in community for another year, and my sin affects everybody else. And I need forgiveness. And I'm asking for forgiveness from my fellow men as well as from God. And then the priest does that with every person in the entire community. And then you go, if you're second in line, you get everybody. And so eventually it goes all the way around a big circle, depending on how big your church is. And you've literally asked for personal forgiveness and given a hug to
Mhm.
every member of your church. It's a level of intimacy that maybe a lot of people can't relate to in their church. They don't know everybody's name necessarily. But wow, is it powerful? And there's lots of tears. I'm asking
Mhm.
forgiveness of my wife and my children as well as strangers, essentially. And it's a beautiful, beautiful kickoff to Lent.
It really is, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's actually one of the practices that immediately made me want to become Orthodox because I've never seen anything like it. And for those who don't know what this is, find an Orthodox church on Forgiveness Vespers, Forgiveness Sunday, and go. It's fun. We let visitors come and go through the whole process with us, but it's like you're like a domino line because everyone, as soon as you do it to the person in front of you, you turn around and now you're standing and the next person in line, and you say, is God forgives, I forgive. Yeah, please forgive me, a sinner. It's absolutely beautiful. And it does actually make you, like, for when I do it, I actually literally have flashbacks of all of the confessions I've had all year, of all the people that I was irritated with or that I judged. And when I'm doing that, I'm literally remembering those confessions and asking them to forgive me. And
Yes.
they don't know that I've confessed that I that I was judging them, but I know it.
Right.
And so for me, it's a
Yeah.
moment of real healing, and it's beautiful. And you're all sweaty when you're done. I mean, because everybody's
Yeah.
bowing and prostrating
It's
and up
very
and down, and
physical. Yeah.
it is, yeah,
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 and
it's
some
beautiful.
some years the priest will tell us not to do a full prostration kneeling. He'll just say, make a bow, and we're like, thank you. But some days you're doing, at St. Andrew it can be 300 people.
Yeah.
You're doing a lot of prostrations, but yeah, it is funny when you think, very privately you're thinking, forgive me for all those daggers that I threw you with my eyes one time. They hopefully don't even know the ways that maybe
Yeah.
we've sinned against each other, but it's a total clean slate. And maybe everybody knows this, and you already know this, but I just learned a couple of years ago that this is families can do the forgiveness rite at the end of evening prayers in their home every evening. And so we've started doing that. We do our evening prayers together probably more like 3 or 4 times a week because of events and stuff. But in theory, every night you're doing your evening prayers as a family, and we do the rite of forgiveness with just the five of us, my four kids and my wife and I. And it is such a powerful uh, bedrock of peace in the home. It's amazing.
That is beautiful. I never would have thought of that, but that is a great idea.
I just heard about it and I was like, immediately like, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? It's just it's part of our routine now. And if we do our pre-communion prayers at church or at home on Sunday before church, we'll do it right then because we're going to communion, and we want to come to the Eucharist with
Hmm.
reconciliation, right? Not just fasting and prayer, but
Right.
reconciliation.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, we haven't talked much about your essay, so I want to get into a few things here. Um, one one of the big parts that I wanted to talk to you about was virtue. If you could give our listeners a peek into what you say in this essay about virtue, that would be great. There, you say a lot about virtue. So whatever you want to
Mhm,
say, I'm just going to give you the
mhm.
floor.
All right. Yeah. Well, just stop me when I've gone too long because this is a topic of academic interest for me as well as I think a very big part of the meaning of life, right, is actually finding out what virtue is and pursuing that and being relentless because virtue is human excellence and we are human beings, but we're not finished human beings. We're given the raw human material, but we're also giving a human mission to become human beings. And becoming a human being is, with God's help, something that we are responsible for. We actually have to take the reins of our character and actually pursue it. So it's a lifelong journey. It's a journey of formation. It's not merely a journey of ethics in the thin sense of that word of like doing the right thing and being a nice person. It's a journey of transformation of becoming a certain kind of person. The courageous person does courageous things, but the courageous person, even Aristotle recognized, is a certain kind of person. That courage, the courageous deeds, fall out of the courageous person naturally because they've developed this habit of doing the courageous thing in the right way at the right time for the right reasons. My students are always quick to point out, if somebody's doing good deeds for show, that sort of doesn't count, right? And Christ says that don't do your good deeds to be admired by men. However, even Aristotle would say if you're doing it for recognition, you're not doing it in the right way. So we haven't
That's
even
right.
reached the definition of virtue if you're doing it for show. The
Yeah,
virtuous person.
actually, I am going to interrupt you on that
Mhm,
because I I love all the work that classical schools are doing, and I think they're doing a great job, and they're trying to, help instill virtue. And I mean, that's really a huge part of classical education. But one of the things that I would like to hear you talk about
mhm,
is, and I want to tread lightly about this though, virtue awards at schools, virtue walls. Do you know what I'm talking about here?
mhm,
Like where you're giving awards to students for being, you know what I'm saying? These different virtues. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I've seen that in
mhm.
schools and it seems to me to contradict what you're saying.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple pieces to that, right? So we we give candy to our kids for, doing their chores or something like that. Like these are extrinsic rewards that work for children because they don't have that intrinsic motivation yet. And I think that's fine and developmentally appropriate. So if little Johnny gets a pat on the head and gets a virtue award for being generous. I don't think anyone should confuse that with like the intrinsic rewards of virtue, which are, you know, immense. And so, so I do think there's a fair amount of room there to say when we are giving awards, what else are we going to give them for? Are we going to give them for citizenship, which I think is a really kind of weird modern uh, take on describing virtue. I don't know what citizenship means, but I know what virtue is. So maybe we should give awards based on virtue. But secondly, I do think those should be phased out over time, and that as students are able, junior high, high school, the discussion of virtue needs to become much more interior. It needs to become about your actions, and your motivations and your habits all at once. Even the, for Aristotle, again, the basic standards for virtue are so much higher than we could probably, guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, and there's not that many virtues, right? The classical virtues are 4, maybe 10. Um, so we can start to work seriously on them without getting overwhelmed and help our students see, you know what, you really don't have this virtue. You give up easily, for example, would be a lack of courage. You are frightened by pain. You're frightened by hard work. You don't have this virtue. You need to work on this virtue. We can introduce the real pursuit of virtue and the real recognition of vice without overwhelming them, but also showing them this matters because it's you. You carry yourself with you wherever you go. I don't care about the awards on your wall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, well, and I personally feel like there's a little too much on the reward system that I see, and uh, I'm not really seeing the fruit coming out of it personally.
Hmm.
One of the things that you did say in the essay that I really liked is you said, let me find it here. Virtue is difficult or impossible to teach directly. Do you want to
Hmm.
expand on that a little bit? I really agreed with that strongly,
Hmm.
and I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
That ties in a little bit with the George MacDonald quote, right? That trying too hard to make somebody good is one of the ways to make them worse.
Yeah.
Um, and especially when it's coming from, say in me as a teacher, it's coming from a place of hypocrisy or a place of judgment, a place of superiority. You students are always doing this where I would never do that. And that is a temptation for parents and teachers alike. Um, so I think that the idea there is that even Socrates recognized 2,400 years ago, if virtue could be taught, all virtuous fathers would have virtuous sons, but they don't. Therefore, virtue can't be taught. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's true that you can't infallibly just assembly line certain character traits. And I think that the reason is, at least partly because of the mystery of free will, right? So in theory, you could be a perfect parent and your children could still rebel and walk away and do their own thing. We know that our Lord was a perfect teacher, but one of his disciples rejected him. And that's not because of bad teaching or bad modeling. It's because of the mystery of free will. But the second thing is, how do you teach virtue? You teach it indirectly. You teach
Mhm.
it through example. Do you think you have to talk about it? You have to give vocabulary to it, and reading great literature helps with this. Like reading Dante, he has a taxonomy of virtue. There's this virtue and this sub virtue and this sub vice, and it's all laid out there for you. You have to learn like what the virtues are, and then you have to see what they're like in daily life on the road. I'm very aware if I'm impatient with a driver and my kids are in the car, that they're seeing I'm modeling a certain kind of, maybe a lack of tolerance for pain or lack of tolerance for other people and impatience with people. And it's like, okay, well, what am I teaching with that? What am I teaching when I'm talking about the content that I'm, teaching in the classroom? And I'm saying, wow, this book's really long. This book's really hard. This book's really abstract. I'm sort of modeling I wish life was more entertaining. Our kids get plenty of entertainment as it is. Um, so I think that, as teachers, we need to be on the path towards virtue. And I try to be very clear in the chapter because the more that you describe these lofty ideals, the worse you can feel as an actual teacher, and you see how fall you short, how far you fall short. I try to play both of those sides because it's like just being aware that you need to start on this journey is a big step. Just being aware that you are, you know, in a sorry state, that's humility, and that's good to model to the students. And
Mm-hmm.
say, hey guys, this book was really hard for me. I look forward to studying it with you because I want to grow in understanding. And if it was hard for you, I understand that. I get that. And then, one kid raises his hand and says, I think I understood it. And you go, great. Okay. Teach us, help us. So, modeling humility, we can all start there. And then modeling the pursuit of virtue is you make a little bit of progress. That's going to give our students and our children, again, a chance to see what that would really look like for them. And I think that's where they make the choice to, who to imitate, and they make the choice to go on that path of life too.
Yeah, I love that. That's really good. Can you talk a little bit about dispassion? I thought that was really brilliant that you brought this up in the essay. You said here, all virtue begins and ends with dispassion, and yet most students and most Americans have not heard this word defined. Dispassion is the quieting or healing of the soul's power of anger, desire, and self-seeking, which leaves room for the corresponding fiery love for God. By contrast, passions are the central obstacle of human life. So explain a little bit about how, as Orthodox, we look at this issue and why it's important in education in a classical school.
Hmm. So when I was becoming Orthodox, this was one of the topics, the topic of the passions and the healing of the passions, or sometimes eradication of the passions. This is one of the topics that I thought was the most surprising, because I had studied ethics. I'd heard a lot about right and wrong, about duty, and about morality, and I just hadn't heard a whole lot about the passions. And it turns out that um, the passions are actually the when you want to talk about the practical pursuit of virtue, this is the most practical thing you can do, is identify your top one or two passions and work on combating that either with prayer, with fasting, with almsgiving. It's usually one of those three, and lean into that, let's say, tool. So a personal example for me would be, I don't think I ever fasted a day in my life, as growing up as a Protestant Christian. Maybe I fasted by myself once or twice because I heard a sermon about it or something like that, but it was never systematic, and I didn't really know what I was doing. Turns out that one of my besetting passions, right, is immoderation, or an over attachment to food and pleasure and entertainment and these kinds of things. So I've been living my whole life with this sickness of this passion of immoderation, and fasting is the tool that directly, how firefighters don't spray water at the top of the fire, they shoot it down at the bottom of the fire. It doesn't even look like it's on fire, because if you hit down there, the whole fire goes out. Get to the source. So fasting is this, discipline that gets to the source of that passion. So now doing a little bit of spiritual labor is having a big impact, a big effect. I'm getting more bang for my buck, so to speak. And that can be true for anybody. If pride, for example, is one of your besetting sins, then you have to work on humility. How do you work on humility? Obedience. Obey your boss, obey your parents, obey your teachers, obey your pastor. Don't question them. Don't grumble in your heart when you're obeying them. See if you can work on obedience, and you'll see, whoa, that passion has a big hold on me, right? As soon as you start to resist it, you start to see how big it is. So the passions are what the Father's diagnosis our real problem. That's the root of our problem, is the passions are, essentially habitual sins, if you want to think of it that way.
Hmm.
Sins of feeling, sins of the body, sins of the mind, sins of the eyes. We actually also ignore those. I have a whole different tangent we could go on there. But when Christ was tempted in the desert, he had a temptation into his flesh, was the bread. To his eyes was actually, the devil inviting him to commit idolatry for the sake of getting glory and being an idol to everybody else.
Hmm.
And then pride being, given the opportunity to prove he was the Son of God. These are like the three big passions, and Christ overcame all of them. And he showed us the way to overcome them. So that process of identifying your passions, repenting, and actually putting in the work, right? This is not work-based salvation by any means, but this is work exercise. It's spiritual labor, putting in the work to quiet those passions. And actually the fathers say, heal those passions. there is a good version of anger, right? There is righteous anger. If wrath is one of your passions, you can redirect that anger, the fathers say, towards the devils and towards the temptations that come to you. So now your anger is properly oriented toward your own sin and not oriented towards your neighbor in a destructive way.
Hmm.
So this state, I know it sounds again way too exalted, and I cannot relate, but I've read that there's this state of dispassion where you aren't continually tossed around by these temptations. And you're able to pray in peace, and you're able to do the good deeds that are set out before you in peace. And of course, temptation is always there, but you have some skills and some practice at overcoming temptation. And this is the state of dispassion. And it opens up, you could say, a whole new world when it comes to spiritual life.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think this was an important part of this chapter, and how, as teachers, modeling the humility and modeling that is going to be really helpful, to set the right atmosphere and tone for your classroom, for your school, for your whole school. And that, I think, leads me to thinking about how, that is the Orthodox phronema. That is the Orthodox. I mean, that is the Christian. I mean, I'm saying Orthodox, but that is Christian. It is the Christian way. And
Hmm.
I was reading recently St. Paisios the Athonite's book on prayer, and he talks a lot in there about philotimo,
Hmm.
which
Love of
is
self.
love, the
Yeah.
love of God and love of the neighbor, and how that to me is very much what the atmosphere of a school should be.
Hmm.
It should be, we should be putting the love of God and the love of neighbor first before anything else.
Hmm.
And so what does that look like from a pedagogical perspective in the classroom? And I
Hmm.
thought deeply about that, and I thought, well, you know what it really looks like? It looks like good habit training in the classroom, like really training students in those habits. And I've recently been thinking about how important it is in the school, especially for K-5, to
Hmm.
really get the students, like half of their education should be in habit training. Learning to pay
Hmm.
attention is huge.
Hmm.
Attending to keeping your desk clean and neat and putting your things away, so that other people aren't having to step over your coat that's on the floor. Thinking of other people when you're cleaning up after yourself, right?
That's
And
right.
and that is a form of loving your neighbor, of is the habit training. And I feel like so many teachers have so many things to check off to try to get through in the day, that sometimes that habit training isn't the priority. And I
Hmm.
honestly think if the kids learn the habit training, and let me tell you how to do that in a second, but if they learn their habit training, um, it's actually going to make them better students when they're older. They're going to actually do better academically. So, for instance, taking them outside for nature study and teaching them how to sit quietly and listen,
Mm.
and to how to attend and look at a leaf for a few minutes, and then tell back every detail you remembered on that leaf. What that's doing is it's teaching them how to pay attention to details. And that's a habit that's going to serve them in every academia subject that they're going to study. Anyhow,
Mhm,
so I just was thinking about that as I was reading some of your essay, and I don't know
mhm.
specifically what I read in here that made me think that, but
Yeah.
it was kind of a theme I was feeling, about loving, and as I was reading it, the phronema and the philotimo ideas, these Greek beautiful ideas that are tied to virtue and love, which is what we're
Mhm.
doing in a classical school, and how do we accomplish that?
Yeah, the habit of attending to other people, right? It's not automatic. We're sort of naturally aware of ourself, our pleasures and
Hmm.
pains, and thinking of others and actually seeing. There's a great line from a secular philosopher named John McDowell that I studied back in grad school, where he said the kind person isn't just the one who does the kind thing. The kind person is the one who has the eyes to see that kindness is called for in this situation. And
That's
so
right.
that's like a really beautiful sort of, oh, I see that caring for my neighbor is called for right now. I see that they exist and that I have an obligation to them. Even having eyes to see that requires some training. And it sort of it takes on a life of its own, right? Once you can see my neighbor's sad, my neighbor's annoyed, my neighbor wants to walk by my chair. Once you can see that your neighbor exists, a lot of the right thing to do falls out naturally. But we have a problem that I, I know what I want to say, so I'm going to say it. I don't know how anyone else is going to react to it, but I'm just thinking about what I want to say. So I'm going to raise my hand. I'm going to say it. We have that natural selfishness that, it is there in our children, but we have to like grow out of it. We have to practice,
Mhm.
not to mention what you said about paying attention to what God wants, right? To actually our obligation to love God. So that's powerful stuff.
It is. It is. I think one of the spots where I'm finding it in your essay is towards the beginning. It's actually in that section on defining initiation.
Hmm.
Um, you say a bad teacher is the one for whom academics are a mere game to get students to play, one that isn't really important, or a chore to get students to do, drudgery, but it must be done. Instead, teachers must recognize that school is real life. This is what you were saying at the beginning of our interview here. School is a
Hmm.
high stakes microcosm of the rest of life. Education matters. Students who learn to be disciplined, prayerful, friendly, inquisitive, and otherwise seekers of virtues and wisdom are more likely to continue this search until they meet the Lord face to face. A teacher who cares about this high stakes opportunity and cares about the student's success in this can transmit that fervency in the classroom. And that's where I was seeing the idea of the Orthodox phronema and philotimo
Hmm.
actually. And I loved that because the telos of education is that a student grows up and actually cares,
Hmm.
that they
Hmm.
care. Because if you
Their heart is in the
care,
right place.
that's right. And I remember a couple of years ago on my podcast, I interviewed naturalist John Muir Laws, and he talks about nature journaling, how to do nature journaling. He's a beautiful person. And one of the things he did on that interview was he defined love. And I don't know the full definition that he said, but the one part of it that I remember that he said that really struck me was love is the act of sustained attention.
Hmm.
I just love that might actually be the full definition he gave, but love is the act of sustained attention. And the longer
Hmm.
you attend to something, the more you're going to love it. And so we think about those things that we spend our time attending to, that's what we love. And so if we
That's right.
spend our time attending to the other people in the classroom and thinking, I need to clean up after myself because I care about the other people around me, right? Rather than I
Hmm.
just have to clean this up because my teacher said to.
Right.
Totally different reason. So training the students, young kindergarten kids, the teachers need to be doing this. And I would love for the teachers to email their parents and say, here's what we're working on in the classroom. Here's some ideas on how you can do this at home too.
Hmm.
Weekly emails from the teacher to the parent with one habit that they've been working on in the classroom that now they can say, I would encourage you to work on this at home too, because it will make the whole idea of education as a life
Yes.
work. Anyhow,
And that
so
that child will feel the conspiracy closing in around them. I have to I have to be selfless at school and at home and at church. No, it's happening.
yeah, so I really appreciated this article, this essay. And we didn't even get to talk about half of it. There's so many good things in this. It's rich with wisdom and beauty. And so it's in the book, and I will post a link where people can buy this Into the Light book that David Hicks, for those of you who don't know, wrote this seminal work, Norms and Nobility, that is a very, very dense book on classical education that we recommend people read when they're ready for a very dense book on classical education.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
he was
one of the
also
heavy
on my,
hitters for sure.
yeah, David Hicks. I also interviewed him in my podcast too, so people can look. I'll put links in the show notes for those episodes.
Hmm.
I very much enjoyed this conversation, and before we end, I always close my interviews asking one of two questions. One, what is a quote from a book, a quotation from a book that has had a huge impact on you? Or what is a book that you wish you would have read earlier in your life?
Well, there is a lot of answers to the both of those questions, and I narrow it down. It's actually one of the quotations on my desktop right now. It's from the Republic. 450b is the Stephanus reference, and in context, Socrates is saying basically the Glaucon and some of the others are asking him these big questions, and he's kind of warning them this is not going to be a short answer. This is going to be a long conversation you're stirring up. And um, and Glaucon says, well, we'll just have as much conversation as this proper measure. We'll just keep it within bounds. And Socrates responds, and he says, the proper measure for such discussions is the whole life. And that I remember talking about that in a sort of long, painfully meticulous discussions of the Republic. And one of the things that we came up with that line is, you know, they're saying learning should be kept within bounds. Even Glaucon, who's a great student, learning should be kept within bounds. The assumption is that for you're done with school. You take school, you move on to real life. That you have this you know maybe you can talk about those airy fairy ideas while you're in philosophy class, but now we're going to get down to brass tacks. All of these attitudes are contrasted with the attitude Socrates has that the proper measure for the search for wisdom, in this case, the search for justice, right, in that conversation, the proper measure is your whole life. This is a lifelong pursuit. And I know that's sometimes a cliche, but this is really being virtuous, being wise is something that I get to take with me beyond the grave if I can ever attain to any of that. I don't get to take anything else. And so this is an effort, this is a prize that's worth a whole lifelong of pursuit. And yeah, love the Republic. I'm going to go teach it right now in about 10 minutes. But that's definitely one of my favorite quotes from the Republic.
That's a great quote. I love the Republic. It's rich with all kinds of golden nuggets, isn't it?
Hmm.
Um, I, since you said that, I'm just going to read a quote, a quotation that I sign off all my emails on, because it reminded me exactly of what you're saying here, that Socrates says it's a lifelong, learning is lifelong, right? So
Hmm.
George MacDonald, this is from A Dish of Orts, says, for repose is not the end of education. Its
Mm.
end is a noble unrest, an ever renewed awakening from the dead, a ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future, an urging on of the motions of life, which had better far be accelerated into fervor than retarded into lethargy. So the end of education is not the end. It keeps going. It's a noble unrest. You want to keep learning more and more and more. That's what a classical education is supposed to give to the students, this noble unrest. And it sounds like that's the kind of education you had. You just continue, you fell into the great books and you just developed that noble unrest.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, every day I feel like I'm a beginner, and I know people, teachers, parents feel like they're behind in some sense, and wow, I haven't read that, or I don't know Latin, or but it's just if you love it, you don't mind being a beginner and being looking like a dunce sometimes. Just dive in every day and make a little bit of progress.
Right. That's why I do this podcast because I get to meet all kinds of wonderful people and learn more and more and more. It's so fun. Learning is fun. It should be fun.
It's the best.
So, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate this, and we'll get some things in the show notes and some of the things we've talked about, some of the quotations. I see we're doing it. We're gonna change this bad
I
habit. We're
can
gonna
I can now recommend
quotations.
this podcast to my students because they won't be razzing me about.
Right. So we'll get some things in the show notes, and I just really appreciate your time. This was a fun conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on and for inviting me and plugging the book. Hope everybody gets a chance to look it up and get a copy. It's got a lot of articles in it, so it's kind of a reference book. You can pick up Josh Gibbs's article is fantastic, of course. The introduction and the outro by Father Anthony are amazing, talking about the integration of parish life with education. So there's a lot to love in there. Hope people get a chance to read it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.